The cathedral bells had not yet finished ringing when the crowd parted, and into the cleared space at the bottom of the steps came the Duke of Renfell, and he went down upon one knee before a woman in rags, whom no person in that town had troubled to look at for 3 years. There was a sound the crowd made when he did it, not a gasp, not a cry, but the small, collective intake of 50 people learning at once that the world was not arranged the way they had believed it that morning. His coat was the deep navy that meant rank to everyone who saw it. The hem of it touched the wet stone. He did not appear to notice. He had eyes only for the seated woman, for the cracked hands folded in her lap, for the face turned half away from him, as though she could not bear to be the cause of so much looking. You will want to know how a man who could have any door in the county open to him came to kneel in the rain before a beggar. So did everyone on those steps, yet the answer to that did not begin on the steps. It began 3 winters before, in a quiet upstairs room where a girl was dying, and a stranger no one had sent for sat down at the foot of the bed and began, very softly, to sing. Her name was Tabitha Vane, and once, in a life that felt now like something she had read about rather than lived, she had been a music teacher. She had not been born to wealth, but she had been born to comfort, which is its own kind of fortune, until it is taken away. Her father had kept a music school in a market town 2 days' ride from the sea, and from the time she was small, she had sat under his pianoforte with her cheek against the cool wood and felt the notes come down through the boards into her bones. She had a gift. Everyone who heard her said so, in that careful way people have of praising a girl they do not expect to need it. By the time she was 20, she taught the daughters of attorneys and clergymen and 1 or 2 minor gentry, and the small income from it kept her father in tobacco and her in gloves, and she had supposed, without ever quite framing the thought, that her life would go on in this manner until it gently ended. It did not gently end. It ended in the space of 1 autumn, the way these things do. Her father took a fever in October and was in the churchyard by the first frost, and the school, which had been his name and his reputation and not hers, dispersed within the month. The families who had sent their daughters to the great Mr. Vane did not send them to his unmarried daughter. There was the matter of propriety. There was the matter of a young woman alone. There were a great many matters, all of them spoken in the same soft, regretful voice, and not one of them concerned with whether she would eat. By the new year, the house was let to a corn factor, and Tabitha had taken a position as governess in the household of a baronet 40 miles distant, and that, she told herself, was the natural order reasserting itself. A woman of her station who had lost her protector found another roof. She was grateful for it. She made herself grateful for it every morning, because gratitude was cheaper than grief and lasted longer. What she did not yet know was that the roof she had found was the one that would cost her everything. She had left. The baronet's house was cold, in a way that had nothing to do with the fires. The mistress of it, a thin, pale woman, much occupied with her own delicate health, regarded the governess as one regards a useful piece of furniture that has unaccountably begun to have opinions. The children were sullen, and the schoolroom was at the top of the house where the wind came through the casement, and Tabitha taught them their letters and their sums, and a little French, and when no one was listening, a little music. She would not have called herself unhappy. She had learned by then that unhappiness was a luxury, like grief, that a woman in her position could not afford to indulge. The trouble came in the second spring, and it came in the shape of the baronet's nephew, a loud young man down from town with debts and appetites and the easy cruelty of a person who has never once been refused. He decided that the governess was a diversion. She refused him in the cold corridor outside the schoolroom, refused him plainly and without raising her voice, and 3 days later a brooch belonging to the mistress was discovered by the nephew at the bottom of the governess's workbox. She had never seen the brooch before. It did not matter that she had never seen it. The household did not want a thief, but it wanted a scandal involving its nephew still less. And a governess accused is a governess dismissed. And the only question that remained was whether they would trouble the magistrate. They did not trouble the magistrate. They were generous, the mistress said, in not troubling the magistrate. They turned her out the next morning with the wages they owed her withheld against the value of the brooch, which meant they turned her out with nothing at all. To the household she left behind, she was a thief and a liar who had got off lightly. Pah! That was the first telling of it, spoken at the breakfast table the morning she walked out the gate, and it was the truest thing about how the world had decided to see her. She had been seen, and weighed and found to be a person of no account, and the verdict had been entered, and the verdict was final, and it would follow her down every road she walked for 3 years. She walked a great many roads. A woman without a character cannot get a position, and a woman without a position cannot get a character. And so she came down through the ranks of the respectable the way water comes down a hillside, finding every lower place. She took in sewing until her eyes failed in the bad light. She scrubbed steps. She carried coals. And then one hard winter, she could not get even the coals to carry. And she learned the last lesson, which is that there is a floor below which there is no work at all, only the cold and the kindness of strangers, and the long practice of being invisible. It was in a cathedral town some 60 miles from where she had begun that she stopped walking. She could not have said why that town, and not another. She had heard the bells across the fields one evening, and something in her had simply decided it would go no further, and she had come in through the west gate and found a dry corner in the lee of the almshouse wall, and there she had stayed. The almswomen who had little shared a little. A widow named Mrs. Dels. Pruett, sharp-tongued and soft-handed, brought her broth on the cold nights and did not ask her history, which was the greatest kindness of all, and in time gave her the corner of a pallet under the almshouse eaves when the snow came. In exchange, Tabitha did what work her strength allowed, and asked for nothing, and learned the particular geography of a town seen from the ground, from the level of the boots that stepped around her. She learned which doorways the constable swept and which he let be. She learned the hours of the markets and the charity of the bakers at closing. And she learned, without ever meaning to, the great house on the hill above the town, because everyone in the town learned it, the way you learn the weather. It was the seat of the Duke of Renfell, and it sat gray and enormous against the sky, and from it, the whole ordering of the county descended like light from a high window. She had been a year in the town, perhaps a little more, when the singing began. It was not for herself that she sang. She would never have dared. It was for a child, a fretful, sick infant belonging to one of the laundresses who sheltered near the almshouse. And the child would not settle, and its crying went on into the small cold hours, until Tabitha, half asleep against the wall, began without quite deciding to, very low, an old air her father had taught her. The kind of melody that is more breath than voice. The child quieted. And after that, when the nights were long and the cold made sleep impossible, she sang. Always, softly. Always the old airs, the lullabies and the laments, the music that asked nothing and gave a little warmth. The almswomen came to expect it. It became, Mrs. Pruett said once, the one thing the cold could not take from any of them. She did not know that voices carry. On still nights, farther than the singer imagines, she did not know who walked the lane below the almshouse wall in the dark, unable to sleep, and stopped and listened. Here I will ask you to hold one thing in your mind, because she could not, because she had forgotten she possessed it. She still had the gift. The cold and the shame and the 3 years of being no one had not reached down far enough to take it. It was still in her hands and her throat, waiting, the way a thing waits under snow. Keep that with you. She will need you to remember it when she cannot. The man on the hill had a grief of his own. Edmund, Duke of Renfell, was a man of 32 whom the county found cold, and the county was not entirely wrong, though it was wrong about the cause. He had not always been cold. There had been a time, not so many years before, when Renfell had been a house full of music and argument and the particular noise of 2 people who had been left, very young, with only each other, for the Duke had a sister. Lady Sophia was 4 years his junior. and the one creature in the world to whom he had never had to be a duke. She was quick and irreverent and unwell, in the way that the beautiful young in those years were so often unwell, a delicacy of the lungs that the physician spoke of in hopeful murmurs and could do nothing to mend. He had taken her everywhere. A duke could take a fragile sister, to the waters at one resort and the airs of another, and had watched the murmurs grow less hopeful, and had brought her home at last to Renfell to do the only thing left, which was to make her dying comfortable. It was a slow dying. That was the cruelty of it. There were months of it, a long grey procession of physicians and draughts and shortened breath, and through all of it Lady Sophia, who had been the most alive person her brother had ever known, was shut up in a quiet room watching the autumn come down outside her window. She bore it with a wit that broke his heart. The nights, though, were the worst. In the nights the cough was at its cruelest and the fear came, and there was nothing her brother's rank, or his money, or his desperate helpless love could do against the small hours when the great house seemed to hold its breath, and a girl of 28 lay awake afraid to sleep because she was not sure she would wake. It was on one of those nights that the music came in at the window. Tabitha had not known whose window it was. The almshouse lane ran, as such lanes do, along the base of the great house's lower garden, and on a certain still night the air she sang for a sick laundress's child had carried up the slope, and in through a casement left open for the dying girl's breath, and Lady Sophia, who could not sleep, had heard it. A woman's voice, low and true, singing an old lament about a ship that did not come home, and then a lullaby, and then silence. And the next night, the Duke, sitting with his sister, had seen her turn her head toward the open window and wait, and had understood, when the voice came, that she was waiting for it. He could have sent a servant down to find the singer and pay her to come and sing in the room. That is what his rank would have advised. There was something in his sister's face as she listened, though a peace he had not been able to buy for her with all of Renfell, and he was afraid of breaking it. So instead, on the third night, he went down himself. This is the thing the county never learned, and would not have believed. But not have believed. The Duke of Renfell went down the dark garden in his shirt-sleeves like a poacher, and came to the almshouse wall and found in the lee of it a thin woman wrapped in a borrowed mantle, singing to the dark. And he did not announce himself. He stood in the shadow of the wall and listened to the end. And then he said, very quietly, that his sister was dying, and that his sister could hear her, and that he would be in his debt past any paying of it, if she would come and sing in the room. She came. Of course she came. She would have come for anyone's dying sister. And she did not know he was a duke, and by the time she did know it, she had already sat at the foot of Lady Sophia's bed 3 nights running, and it was too late for her station to matter to either of them. For a thing happens in a sick room that happens nowhere else. The ordinary order of the world thins. A dying woman of the first rank and a beggar woman with a true voice, alone together in the small hours, are simply 2 women, one of whom is frightened, and one of whom knows how to make a little warmth against the dark. They became, in those last weeks, something the world has no proper word for. Not mistress and servant. Not patron and pensioner. Friends, perhaps, if the word can stretch to hold 2 people so far apart that they should never, by every law of their world, have spoken at all. Tabitha sang, Lady Sophia to sleep on the nights she could sleep. On the nights she could not, she talked, or listened, or simply held the cold, thin hand, and let the fear pass through it into her own steady one. And the Duke was there, in the corner of the room, in the chair by the door, watching the one person his rank could not help his sister being helped by a woman the world had thrown away. He did not say much. He was not a man who said much. Still he learned her. In those weeks, in the particular way you learn, a person you watch comfort someone you love. He learned that she was gentle without being soft, and proud without being vain, and that she had been a lady once and would not speak of how she had ceased to be one. He learned that her hands, when they were still, lay folded with the discipline of hands that had been trained to an instrument. He learned, in short, exactly who she was, while the whole county below the hill went on believing she was no one at all. Lady Sophia died on a morning in late November, with the first snow on the window and the old lament half sung, and at the end she was not afraid. That was the gift Tabitha had given, and it was a gift no duke could have purchased, and Edmund of Renfell knew it. He tried to keep her. This is where you might expect the story to turn warm. And it does not yet. Because grief makes fools, even of good men. In the rawness of those first days, he offered her a place, a permanent place, a cottage on the estate, and a small income, and the right to call herself something better than a beggar, and he offered it badly, the way men offer things when they are afraid the offering will be refused. And it was refused. Tabitha would not be paid for sitting with the dying girl she had come to love. To take his cottage and his coin would have made the thing she had given into a service rendered a transaction, and she would not let it be made into that, not for warmth, not for safety, not for anything. She thanked him with a dignity that shamed him, and she went back down the hill to the almshouse wall. And she did not come up again. He let her go. That was his error, and he knew it almost at once. And by then she had gone back into the great invisible crowd of the poor, and he could not for pride, or for fear of seeming to pursue a beggar woman, go and find her. So the months passed, and the snow came and went, and came again, and the Duke of Renfell grew colder and quieter on his hill. And the woman who had sung his sister out of the world grew thinner against the almshouse wall, and the two of them lived within half a mile of each other and did not meet, and the county, which knew nothing of any of it, went on arranging the duke's future to suit itself. For a single duke is a problem a county feels obliged to solve. The solver-in-chief was his aunt, the Dowager Lady Hester Crawford, his late mother's sister, who had come to Renfell after Lady Sophia's death, on the understanding that a grieving bachelor duke could not be left to manage his own household, by which she meant his own marriage. Lady Hester was not a wicked woman. It is important to understand that she was not wicked, because it would be easier if she were. She was a woman who had spent 60 years inside a single idea, the idea that rank is the truest measure of a person, and that idea had served her perfectly in every drawing room she had ever entered, and she had never once been required to doubt it. She loved her nephew in her way. She wished him settled, and his line secure and his table presided over by a woman whose blood matched his own. She was, in the words of the world she had mastered, entirely correct, and the woman she had selected to be correct with was a Miss Augusta Lindley. Augusta Lindley was 20 and handsome, and the only child of a banker who had bought, with a great deal of money, the kind of connections that money can buy. She had been raised on the certainty that she was a prize, told it so often and so early that she had no more reason to doubt it than she had to doubt that the sun would rise. She was not cruel by nature. She was something more dangerous than cruel, which is incurious. It had never once occurred to her to wonder what the people beneath her felt, because it had never once been necessary. And a question never asked is harder to answer than a question answered wrong. She came to Renfell for the autumn at Lady Hester's invitation, with 3 trunks and a lady's maid and the settled expectation of becoming a duchess by the spring. And she was, the county agreed, entirely suitable. The Duke was civil to her. He was civil to everyone. It cost him something the county could not see to sit across his own dining table from a handsome, incurious girl and make the conversation his rank required, while the chair at the foot of it stood empty where his sister should have been, and the only voice he wanted to hear in his house was singing to the dark somewhere down the hill. He was a duke, however, and a duke does his duty. And his duty, everyone assured him, was Augusta Lindley. It was Lady Hester who first laid eyes on Tabitha, though she did not know it. And it was Lady Hester who first put the verdict of the town into words inside the walls of Renfell itself. The almswomen had come up to the great house at Michaelmas, as was the custom, to receive the dole, and Tabitha had come among them, and Lady Hester, crossing the hall, had seen the line of the poor at the side door and had said to the housekeeper, in the carrying voice of a woman who does not imagine the poor can hear, that the creature at the end was a disgrace and ought not to be given to, for everyone knew her for a thief turned out of a respectable house, and charity to such persons only encouraged them. That was the first voicing, spoken in the side hall, and Tabitha heard every word of it, and took her bread, and said nothing, and went back down the hill. She did not know the woman who had said it was the aunt of the man whose sister she had loved. She knew only the verdict, which was the same verdict she had carried for 3 years, and which she had stopped expecting the world to revise. The Duke did not hear it said. He saw her, though, that Michaelmas in the line of the poor at his own side door. He had not seen her in 11 months. He stood at the window of the long gallery above the courtyard, and looked down at the thin figure at the end of the line, and something in his chest that had been still since November turned over, and he understood 2 things at once, with the awful clarity of a man who has been lying to himself. The first was that she was starving. The second, harder still, was that he had let her. He went down. By the time he reached the courtyard, the almswomen had gone, and he stood in the empty cold and was, for the first time since his sister died, entirely certain of something. He was certain that he had made a coward's choice 11 months before, and that he would not make it twice, and that whatever it cost him in the eyes of his aunt and his county, and the handsome girl asleep under his roof, he was going to find the woman his sister had loved, and he was not this time going to let her go back into the dark. Yet a duke cannot simply walk into the town and search the gutters for a beggar woman. The thing must be done in a manner the world can survive, and so he did what such a man does, which is that he waited for an occasion. And he found one in the great winter charity assembly that the diocese held each year in the cathedral close, the one event in the calendar where the high and the low of the county stood, for an hour, in the same cold air. It was Lady Hester who made the assembly into a battlefield, though she believed she was only making it into a triumph. She had grown uneasy. She was too long in the world not to feel a change in the wind, and she had felt one in her nephew, a new attentiveness, a way he had begun to ask after the parish poor that did not suit a duke, and frightened her more than open rebellion would have. She did not know its cause. Clenger. She knew, though, the cure for a duke grown strange was a duke got safely married, and so she pressed the match forward, and she arranged that Augusta Lindley should be presented to the whole county, at the charity assembly, as all but the duchess she was meant to be. And she dressed the girl in white and diamonds and set her at the front of the cathedral, close like a verdict the county was meant to ratify. And Tabitha was there too. She was always there. The charity assembly was, for the poor of the town, the one day the bread was certain, and she came with the almswomen and Mrs. Sodder. Pruett and stood at the cold edge of the close, where the poor were permitted to stand, in her rags and her borrowed mantle, with the snow beginning, and watched the county arrange its glittering self at the warm center where she was not permitted to go. She saw the white girl with the diamonds. Everyone saw the white girl with the diamonds. And she saw the Duke come in his deep navy coat, grave and tall and entirely alone inside the crowd that pressed about him, and her heart did the thing it had taught itself not to do, the small lurch of recognition, before she mastered it and looked away. He could not be for her to look at. She had settled that long ago. She had loved his sister and sat with his sister's dying, and that was a thing complete in itself, a thing she would keep, and she would not spoil it by letting herself want what such a thing could never become. She drew the mantle close and fixed her eyes on the cold stones and made herself, as she had made herself 1,000 times, invisible. The Duke was looking for her. He had been looking for her since he came through the gate. And it was Lady Hester watching her nephew's eyes search the crowd, and not rest on the white girl at all, who understood at last where the wind had come from, and made the second mistake of the day, which was much larger than the first. She followed his gaze. She found at the cold edge of the close the beggar woman she had turned from her own side door at Michaelmas, and in the polished, carrying voice of a woman accustomed to settling matters in front of a gathered county and the bishop and the white girl in diamonds, she named aloud the thing she thought she saw. To shame it back into the gutter where it belonged, well, she said loud enough for the warm center to hear and the cold edge to hear and the snow to fall through, that she would not have the day's charity wasted on the worthless, that the creature yonder was a known thief and a disgrace, that some women fell because the world used them ill, and some fell because they were rotten at the root, and that anyone could see which sort stood at the edge of the close. That was the second voicing in the public exchange before the whole county, and it was meant to be the end of the matter. It landed in a silence. The county, which had not been looking at the beggar woman, now looked, because they had been told to, and saw what they had been told to see. A thief, a disgrace, a creature rotten at the root. Tabitha stood in the center of all that, looking with the snow on her shoulders, and did not flinch, and did not weep, and did not run, because she had been seen wrongly so many times that she no longer expected to be seen any other way, and she had learned that the only dignity left to a person seen wrongly is to stand still inside it and refuse to perform the shame the crowd has come to watch. And then the Duke crossed the close. He did not hurry. That was the thing the county remembered, after the terrible unhurried certainty of it, the way a man walks who has stopped weighing a cost because he has already paid it in full, and only the spending of it remains. He walked the length of the cold stones, past his aunt, past the white girl in her diamonds, past the bishop, through the parted crowd. And he did not stop until he stood before the thin woman at the edge of the close, and the whole county held its breath to see what a duke would do to a thief. He went down on one knee in the snow before her. The cathedral bells were ringing the hour, and he knelt in the wet at the feet of the beggar woman no one would look at, and he took the cracked cold hand that had sung his sister out of the world, and he held it, and the close was so silent that the snow could be heard. Then he spoke, and his voice was low and level and carried to every soul on those stones, because the silence carried it. He said only this. He said, "This is the woman who held my sister while she died." He did not say more than that. He did not need to. He did not denounce his aunt, or shame the white girl, or make a speech about worth and rank, because the kneeling had already said everything a speech could say, and said it past any arguing. He named the one fact that reordered the world, and he let it stand in the silence, and the county, which had looked at the edge of the close and seen a thief, looked again and saw a woman who had done the thing none of them had done, who had sat with the dying daughter of the house on the hill through the long nights when rank and money could do nothing, and who had asked for not one farthing in return, and had gone back to the almshouse wall rather than be paid for love. Lady Hester had gone white. The world she had mastered for 60 years had, in the space of 1 minute, rearranged itself around a fact her categories could not measure, and she stood at the warm center of the close and felt the ground she had always stood on become, for the first time in her life, uncertain. She opened her mouth and found nothing in it. The polished sentences that had served her in every drawing room she had ever entered would not come, because there was no polished sentence for a duke kneeling in the snow, and she understood with the particular horror of the always correct discovering they have been wrong, that she had stood at her own nephew's side and called, "The best person on those stones, a creature rotten at the root." The incurious girl had been looking for the first time in her 20 years at something she could not arrange to her own advantage, a man on his knees before a woman in rags, and the looking had done to her what no governess and no sermon had ever managed. She crossed the small distance to where her great-aunt-to-be stood frozen, and she said quietly, not to the county but to Lady Hester, that she did not think she wished to be a duchess after all. Not this way, and not at that price. It was not a grand renunciation, she was not a grand person. Yet it was the first wholly uncalculated thing she had ever done, and it was in its small way the second person on those stones that day to be saved by the kneeling. Tabitha had not moved. She stood with her cracked hand in the Duke's 2 hands and the snow on her shoulders, and looked down into the face of the man kneeling before her, the brother of the girl she had loved, and felt the 3 years of being no one crack open like ice over a river, and what came up through the crack was not triumph, because she was not a person who would ever learn how to triumph. What came up was something quieter and harder to bear. It was the unbearable thing, the thing she had taught herself not to hope for, which was simply to be seen rightly, once, by someone whose seeing mattered, in front of the whole world that had seen her wrongly. She had not known until that moment how much she had wanted it. She had not let herself know. She said his name, not his title. His name the way his sister had said it, low, in the small hours when the fear came. And the Duke of Renfell, kneeling in the snow before the beggar woman no one would look at, bowed his head over her hand, and the county saw a duke weep, and counted it no shame in him at all. What followed was not, the way these things are told, a sudden thing. He did not lift her up that hour and carry her to the great house and make her a duchess by nightfall, because she would not have allowed it, and because the world they lived in did not move so fast, and because the wound in her went deeper than 1 minute in the snow could heal. He rose and he kept her cold hand, and he walked her out of the close, not as a beggar dragged into the light, but as a woman on a man's arm, slowly, while the county made way. And he took her up the hill to the great house, and gave her into the keeping of his housekeeper and Mrs. Braying. Pruett both, and he asked nothing of her that night but that she be warm. The wooing came after, and it came in the only way she would have it, which was, honestly, he did not court her as a duke courts a fortune. He came to her in the room where his sister had died, which she had asked to see and then could not leave, and he sat with her in the chair by the door where he had sat through all those nights, and they talked of Sophia, who was the country they both belonged to. And out of that talking, slowly, over the gray weeks of that winter, the thing between them grew its proper roots. He learned her history at last, the brooch she had never seen, the household that had thrown her down, the 3 years of roads, and he did not pity her, which she could not have borne, but he was angry on her behalf, which she could because anger is a way of saying a thing should not have been, and no one had been angry on her behalf in 3 years. And she learned him. She learned that the coldness the county feared was grief-worn smooth, that the man who said little, because he had learned that the things he loved could be taken in a single autumn, and that he had let her go 11 months before, not from indifference, but from a fear so large he had mistaken it for restraint. She forgave him that. It was easier to forgive than he had dared hope, because she had spent 3 years learning that everyone is, at bottom, only doing the best they can against a fear too large to name, and she had stopped requiring people to be braver than they were. Lady Hester left Renfell before the new year. She was not turned out. The Duke would not have turned out his mother's sister, and Tabitha would not have let him, for Tabitha had buried her own father and knew what it was to be old and suddenly without a place. Lady Hester could not stay, however, because she could not look at the woman she had named a thief in front of the county and go on being the person she had been for 60 years, and the only mercy left to her was distance. She took a house at the spa town where Lady Sophia had once taken the waters, and before she went, she did a thing that cost her more than the county ever knew. She came to Tabitha, in the long gallery, alone, and she said in a voice with all the polish gone out of it, that she had been wrong, and that she was sorry, and that she did not ask to be forgiven because she did not see how she could be. It was the third voicing of the verdict, this last one, and it was the unsaying of it, a known thief, in the mouth of the woman who had made the words public, taken back at last, in a witnessed and halting privacy. Tabitha forgave her anyway, which Lady Hester had not asked for and could not refuse, and the two of them stood a moment in the cold gallery, the old woman who had lost her certainty, and the young one who had lost everything else, and there was for that moment no rank between them at all. They were married in the cathedral in the spring, in the same close where he had knelt, and the poor of the town stood not at the cold edge but in the warm center, because the new Duchess of Renfell would have it no other way, and Mrs. Conson, Pruett, sharp-tongued and soft-handed, sat in a pew near the front in a new gray gown the Duchess had given her and wept without shame all through the service. There were those in the county who murmured that a duke had married a beggar, and there were more by then who had been on the cathedral steps the day he knelt, and who knew that what he had married was the only person in the county who had loved his sister for nothing, and that this was a better foundation for a house than blood or diamonds. And these said nothing, and smiled. If you have stayed with the story this far, you have stayed for the part that is hardest to put into a single line, which is what it means to be seen. So let me leave you with the small thing, and not the large one. The large thing is that Tabitha Vane became a duchess. And that is the part the county told and retold, the beggar on the cathedral steps, and the duke on his knees, a marvel to dine out on for a generation. The large thing is not the true thing, however. The true thing is smaller, and lived in an upstairs room. For the first thing she did, when the house was hers before the wedding, before the gowns, before any of it, was to go up to the room where Sophia had died and have it opened and aired, and to have brought up from the long gallery the pianoforte that had stood silent and shrouded since the girl's death, and to have it tuned. And on a gray afternoon, with the last snow melting off the garden, she sat down at it for the first time in 3 years, the room where she had sung a dying girl out of the world, and she played. Edmund stood in the doorway, where he had stood through all those nights, and did not come in. He listened. The gift, the cold, and the shame, and the 3 lost years had not been able to reach down far enough to take, was there still in her hands, exactly as it had waited, and it came up through her fingers and filled the quiet house. The old airs first, the lament about the ship that did not come home, and then something new, something she made up as she went, for the living and not the dead. And the Duke of Renfell, who had once knelt in the snow before the beggar woman no one would look at, stood in the door of his sister's room, and listened to his wife play, and understood that he had not after all rescued her. He had only in the end been the one person with the sense to stop and listen on a still night, to a voice no one else had troubled to hear, and to follow it down the dark garden to its source, and to find there where the world had sworn there was nothing, everything. The music went on into the evening. Outside, the last of the snow let go of the bare trees and fell, and the long winter was over, and in the warm room a woman who had been no one for 3 years played for a man who had learned too late to be early, and just in time to be true to look.